Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
The day everything changed forever started with 4 words on a family text thread. Winners only, sorry. That was Evan's contribution, typed with the kind of smugness you can hear even when it is just pixels on a screen. And, of course, Lauren chimed in right behind him with her polished add-on. Something about wanting to keep Christmas intimate this year. My parents, Tom and Denise, predictably tried to smooth the edges, with Dad tossing in one of his vague attempts at diplomacy and Mom calling me privately to suggest that I be the bigger person. As though maturity means nodding politely while you get shoved out of your own family's holiday. And the truth is, I didn't argue with any of them, because in that moment something clicked. The holiday wasn't about togetherness anymore, it was about roles, and my role had been reduced to the silent fixer in the background. The one who kept things running while being mocked for not fitting their version of success. So I did not answer. Instead, I sat down at my laptop and started pulling plugs, one after another, because what most of them did not even realize was that half of Evan and Lauren's so-called stability was patched together on the quiet channels I had been covering for years. The family phone plan? I was the primary. I added them back when Evan's credit got flagged for a missed payment, and just for a month somehow turned into 3 years of subsidizing his family's lines. I logged in, selected their numbers, and hit remove. Car insurance? I had let their minivan ride under my policy because group bundling cut costs, and at the time Evan swore he would move it over once things settled. Well, things never settled, but my liability was still hanging there like a trap. I called the agent, split the policy, and swallowed the minor premium increase just to get their names out from under mine. The utilities were another layer. My card had been auto-paying their electricity since the pandemic, when Evan's work dried up, and then I just forgot to detach it. I phoned the company, revoked authorization, and made sure every charge after that day bounced right back to them. It wasn't only the big things either. It was the constant trickle of smaller accounts that add up without you even noticing. Amazon Prime, Hulu, Costco, even the cloud storage plan for their family photos, every one of those subscriptions traced back to me because at some point, in some crisis, it was just easier if I covered it. Well, not anymore. I closed each tab like I was cutting one of those invisible cords that had been keeping me tethered. It was quiet, it was deliberate, and it was not something I announced with fanfare, because here is the lesson I had finally absorbed. Drama is the noise people create while money keeps moving. If you want money to stop moving, you do not make speeches, you change the routing numbers. By the next day, reality started to hit them. Lauren discovered at daycare pickup that the corporate discount they had been using, which came through my employer's benefits package, no longer applied. The staff explained politely that without my payroll tie, the account reverted to the standard rate, which meant they owed the full balance on the spot. Lauren called me from the daycare office, furious, trying to frame this as me punishing her child, and I told her the truth as plainly as I could. The discount was mine, not theirs, and it was not legal for them to keep using it. She sputtered about how I could have given them a heads up, and I reminded her that they had given me their own version of a heads up when they uninvited me from Christmas. And here's the part that really rattled me. Later that same day, I opened the mail and found an envelope addressed jointly to me and Evan. Inside was a letter from the insurance company about the minor accident he had back in the spring, the one he had brushed off as all handled. According to this notice, the claim was closed, but there was still a potential balance that, if unpaid, could roll over onto me as the listed policyholder at the time. It was only $40, a number so small it almost felt insulting, yet what it represented was enormous, because it meant that my credit, my name, my liability could still be dragged into his mess long after I thought I had detached. That was the moment when I realized this wasn't just about the optics of a holiday snub. This was about legal exposure and financial boundaries that had been blurred past the point of safety. I sat with that letter on my couch, staring at it, and instead of feeling sad or excluded, I felt something sharper, something almost like relief, because it gave me the clean justification I needed to go beyond cutting off subscriptions. This was bigger than streaming services and cell phone lines. This was about disentangling myself completely, making sure no signature, no policy, No buried clause could ever leave me holding the bag for Evan's chaos again. And while my parents were leaving messages about holiday spirit, and my brother was no doubt preparing his next round of jabs about being a so-called winner, I had already made my decision. I would not send a single angry word. I would not beg to be included. I would not play their little game. What I would do was protect myself and, for the first time in years, let them find out what life looks like when my quiet financial scaffolding isn't there to keep their walls from crumbling. The funny thing is, people always talk about family first as though it means never saying no, never pulling back, never drawing lines. But sometimes family first has to mean putting an end to the enabling, especially when that enabling is what lets one sibling parade around as a success, while calling another sibling a failure. And when you've been written out of Christmas with the excuse that it is for winners only, it's amazing how much clarity you can find in a single evening with a stack of bills, a legal pad, and a working internet connection. So I ended that week without any speeches, without any blow-ups, without any visible explosions, but with a very different kind of power. I had every receipt, every cancellation confirmation, and a plan to go even further. Because now it was not just about getting even, it was about getting free. And the question, the only real question, was how Evan and Lauren were going to react once they realized the safety net they thought was invisible, permanent, and owed to them had vanished overnight. The morning after I cut those financial ties, I learned very quickly that silence on my part did not mean silence on theirs, because Evan somehow managed to borrow a phone from one of his coworkers just to call me. And the first words out of his mouth were not hello, not even a pretense of civility, but a barked demand. Are you insane? And when I calmly replied with his own smug phrasing, nothing personal, I'm keeping it intimate, he hung up so abruptly I could practically hear the plastic crack of the receiver, which to me only confirmed that he was not processing loss like an adult. He was simply thrashing at the idea of losing control over someone else's resources. Within an hour, Denise called, speaking in the same nervous cadence she always adopted when she wanted to pass along Evan's fury without appearing to take sides, telling me he felt blindsided. As though anyone could truly be blindsided by the collapse of bills they themselves had chosen not to manage for years, and I listened, said little, and knew there would be no satisfying answer to give her, because the issue was not timing, it was entitlement. By mid-afternoon, Lauren had already taken the whole situation public, at least in the subtle performative way she favors, posting one of her carefully curated Instagram stories about people who punish children to get at parents, accompanied by some vague hashtags about kindness and family values, which of course did not name me directly but did not need to, because everyone in her circle knew exactly who she was talking about. The comments under her post filled with predictable heart emojis and verses about forgiveness. A chorus of well-meaning but uninformed voices who could not possibly know that the so-called punishment she was lamenting was nothing more than the natural consequence of a daycare discount that had always been tied to my employer and, therefore, had no legitimate reason to extend to her household in the first place. What unsettled me was not her theatrics, but the fact that Pastor Mike, the man who had baptized Evan's kids and who had officiated countless family ceremonies over the years, decided to text me that evening, gently suggesting that I consider the spirit of the season. I told him, in the most measured tone I could manage, that I was not withholding love, I was withholding my Visa card, and if he could not see the distinction, then he was in no position to mediate. Meanwhile, I began working methodically on the paper trail, because the only way to stay sane when emotions are running high is to anchor yourself in documents that do not lie. I sent an email to the insurance agent who had handled the original bundling of our auto policies, requesting a complete history of every endorsement, every added driver, and every removal, with specific dates, because I wanted a record that could not be twisted into family gossip. I reached out to the daycare itself, informing them in writing that any discount attached to my employer's benefits could only apply to my dependents, and that applying it to non-dependents without authorization was a violation of the policy. They responded with gratitude and confirmed that their system had been updated. I phoned the bank and ordered a new card, simultaneously closing the one that had been quietly auto-paying Evan's utilities for far too long. And for extra certainty, I wrote certified letters to the electric, water, and internet companies, explicitly stating that any charges after the date of my letter were unauthorized and should not be processed. It was tedious, it was clinical, but it was necessary, because unlike my brother, I do not believe in managing crises with a raised voice. I believe in receipts. Still, my parents could not resist staging what they called an early supper, which was their code for a mediation session, and I went, not because I thought anything would be resolved, but because I was tired of being painted as the secret villain behind closed doors. Tom did his usual act of stringing together half-sentences that said nothing, while Denise finally admitted in a weary sigh that my actions had made Evan and Lauren look bad, to which I asked the simplest question I could. Did I make them look bad? Or did the math? The silence that followed was answer enough. On the way home from that dinner, I ran into Mr. Kim, our neighbor who also happened to be Evan and Lauren's landlord, and in the briefest of exchanges, he revealed more than anyone else had in weeks. He told me, with visible discomfort, that Evan's January rent the previous year had bounced twice, and that on the renewal paperwork, he had noticed my name listed as an emergency guarantor, even though he assumed I had agreed to it. I had not. That was an old holdover from years ago when I had co-signed during one of Evan's rough patches, and somehow it had carried forward into new documents without my knowledge. Mr. Kim, in his understated and pragmatic way, offered to provide me a copy of the lease so that I could see for myself what was still attached to me. He called me careful, and then he said I needed to be careful here. And in that moment, I realized he had just become an unexpected benefactor, not because he was swooping in to save me, but because he noticed details that could have quietly destroyed me later. The weekend came, and with it the inevitable bonfire in the family group chat. Evan accused me of deliberately timing all of this to ruin Christmas, a claim that made no sense considering it was his exclusionary text that had set the chain in motion, and I finally typed a single line back. I am removing my name from things I do not use. That is all. Then I muted the thread, because explanations are oxygen to manipulators, and I was done supplying air. On Monday, an email arrived from the insurance agent, attaching the very endorsements I had requested, and in those attachments was a note I had almost expected yet still found chilling. The accident claim from last spring had carried a small fee of $40 that Evan never paid, and though the insurer had eventually written it off, the non-payment had triggered a red flag that kept my liability tethered to his driving record for months. $40. It was such a trivial amount, yet it represented the larger principle that even the smallest neglect on his part could ripple into my financial standing. I printed that email, circled the number, and filed it away, because what I needed most in that moment was a reminder that what I was fighting for was not revenge, not humiliation, but safety. And then, just as I was beginning to feel a thin layer of control return, Lauren posted a glossy family photo captioned with the phrase, "Winners show up." 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Kim containing the lease renewal form, and there in black and white was my name typed under the guarantor section, not signed, but positioned in such a way that any casual observer might assume I had authorized it. That was when the stakes shifted from embarrassing Instagram posts to something much heavier, because if my name was still being carried forward without my consent, then I was not just disentangling myself from subscriptions and phone plans. I was staring down the possibility of fraud. When I opened the renewal form that Mr. Kim had texted me, the weight of what I was really dealing with finally landed. Because seeing my name typed under the guarantor section of a lease I had never laid eyes on made it crystal clear that this was no longer about unpaid subscriptions or a daycare discount, it was about the misuse of my identity. And even though the signature line beneath my name was blank, the mere presence of those letters told me that someone had carried my information forward without permission, and that realization shook me in a way no Instagram story or smug phone call ever could. Mr. Kim, to his credit, immediately acknowledged the clerical error and within the hour emailed me a formal release, confirming that I was not and never had been a guarantor on the most recent lease, but the damage had already been done. Because if it could happen once without me knowing, what else had slipped past me in the years I had been too busy smoothing over my brother's chaos to? Check the paperwork with a magnifying glass. The answer came faster than I expected, tucked inside a bland white envelope from a lender whose name meant nothing to me, but whose letterhead carried a message that made my stomach twist. "We appreciate your continued relationship." Followed by details about a refinance of Evan's minivan that, according to the printout, had been completed in February, though if my memory was right I had seen a credit inquiry tied to his name in March, which left me uncertain whether the date was wrong on their end or whether I had misread my report, and perhaps I am the one misremembering. Though I can already hear people arguing over that discrepancy as if the precise month mattered more than the fact that my contact information had somehow been tangled into a loan I never touched. What mattered to me was that my name had no business appearing on any refinance, and yet there it was, a ghostly trace suggesting that someone, whether by laziness or by deliberate choice, had let the system think I was part of it. That was the moment I stopped trying to handle everything on my own and picked up the phone to call Ashley Reed, an old colleague from my early days in finance operations, who had since moved into compliance work at an insurance firm. Ashley did not waste time with sympathy or gossip. She walked me through 3 concrete steps with the precision of someone who had seen this pattern 100 times. First, she told me to pull my credit reports from all 3 bureaus and immediately freeze them, because even if no active fraud had occurred yet, the freeze would slam the door shut on any new account being opened with my information. Second, she told me to draft a formal dispute letter to the auto lender demanding copies of any authorization records where my name, email, or digital signature appeared, because under federal law they would be obligated to provide them. Third, she insisted that I schedule a consult with a consumer lawyer who could write a proper cease and desist to Evan and Lauren, making it explicit that any further use of my identity would trigger legal action. So I did exactly what she said. I booked an appointment with a lawyer named Fields, who specialized in consumer protection, and I sat in his office while he read the refinance letter with an expression that made me feel both validated and nauseous. He told me that in all likelihood, the lender's system had auto-populated my name into the contact field because I had once been the primary on the insurance policy, but he stressed that we could not rely on assumptions, because assumptions are exactly what allow liability to slide downhill. He drafted a letter on the spot that laid out my position in language so firm and precise it felt like armor. I revoke any implied permission. I am not a guarantor. I demand written confirmation of removal from all records, and I will pursue remedies under state and federal law if my identity is used again. He also instructed me to stop explaining myself to family members over text or phone, because informal words vanish while formal letters build cases. And what I needed now was not reconciliation but evidence. That night, Denise called with her usual blend of guilt and pleading, telling me that Pastor Mike had met with Evan and felt I was holding on to anger, and when I replied that I was holding on to documentation, she sighed and asked whether I could at least come for an hour on Christmas Eve for appearances. I asked her, appearances for whom, because from where I stood the only appearance being maintained was the illusion that Evan was self-sufficient while I carried invisible risk, and when she said I was being dramatic I corrected her with the truth. I was being precise. Evan, meanwhile, had found another disposable number and texted me late at night with one of his favorite manipulative lines, "Return the daycare discount. Kids are off limits." He followed it with a screenshot of the daycare invoice and the word disgusting, as though the responsibility for his unpaid bills rested not on the parents who failed to cover them, but on the sister who had finally cut the cord. I did not reply, because explaining rules to people who thrive on exceptions is like pouring water into a sieve, but I forwarded the screenshot to my growing file, because every piece of outrage he threw at me was also a piece of evidence showing just how dependent he had been all along. Ashley reached out again with something more unsettling than advice. She had quietly looked up the internal notes on Evan's accident claim from the spring and found that my email had been listed as the primary contact, which explained why I had been receiving correspondence even after the policy split. She reminded me she could not share internal files directly, but she pointed me to the exact form I could file under state law to demand all records that tied my identity to any of his claims, and I filed it that same night. feeling both furious and strangely calm, because anger is fire but documentation is steel, and steel is what I needed to walk through this without burning myself down. The next morning, before I had even finished my first coffee, the auto lender responded to my dispute request with an email that made everything real in a way even I could not deny. They attached a log of the refinance authorization, and according to their system, the digital signature had been sent to an email address that looked almost identical to mine except for one swapped letter. And the authorization had been confirmed from an IP address that traced directly back to Evan's house. That was not clerical sloppiness. That was not a random glitch. That was someone using my information in a way that crossed a line I could never uncross, and once I saw it on paper I knew there would be no going back to muted group chats or awkward family dinners. This was now a legal fight, whether Evan admitted it or not. The lender's email confirming that a digital authorization tied to a lookalike version of my address had been executed from Evan's own household internet connection did not simply unsettle me, it hardened my position into something immovable. Because there are misunderstandings, there are sloppy clerical errors, and then there is evidence that someone has intentionally or recklessly blurred the boundary between your life and theirs, and once you have proof of that, no amount of family pleading or pastoral counseling can convince you to treat it like a difference of perspective. I immediately forwarded the email to Fields, the lawyer who had already been helping me draft letters, and he responded within the hour with a new attachment, a clean, concise cease and desist addressed directly to Evan and Lauren, which stated in language so unambiguous it was almost clinical that the IP address associated with the refinance tied directly to their residence, that I had never authorized the action, and that I was demanding both a written release from the lender and a signed acknowledgement from them that my identity would not be used again for any financial purpose. I included Evan and Lauren in the chain, copied the lender, and sat back, because once a message like that goes out, the next move is theirs, not yours. The phone rang almost instantly, because Evan has never been capable of sitting with silence, and he launched into a tirade so loud and fast I could barely separate the words, but the gist was obvious. This was a vendor error, and I was blowing it out of proportion, and if I had any decency I would stop trying to ruin his family's Christmas. I cut him off once, not with volume but with precision, telling him that if it truly was an error, then he would have no trouble signing the release letter that Fields had attached to the email. And the sudden silence on the other end told me more than all his shouting ever could. When he did speak again, it was with the same tired line about legacy, reputation, and how families were supposed to protect each other, but the problem was that for years I had been protecting him at the expense of myself. And all he had done with that protection was construct a facade of success. He had now turned into a weapon against me. Lauren's approach was different, though no less manipulative, because instead of yelling, she framed the entire situation around their children, telling me that cutting off discounts and pursuing legal letters was hurting the kids. And I told her flatly that what hurt children was adults running up obligations they could not pay and then hiding behind innocent faces when the bills came due. She tried to soften it by saying she would be consulting her cousin who is a paralegal, as though the very word paralegal was supposed to intimidate me into silence. But what she did not realize was that paralegal or not, cousin or not, facts do not bend. My parents then scheduled what they insisted would be a calm meeting at their house, and although every part of me wanted to decline, I went, because I was done letting half-truths circulate about me without at least putting the evidence on the table. When I arrived, I carried only a slim folder containing 3 documents: the insurance release showing Evan's minivan fully detached from my policy, the lease release signed by Mr. Kim correcting the guarantor error, and the lender's email confirming the IP address of the refinance authorization. No speeches, no drama, just paperwork. Tom sat mostly in silence, staring at the carpet the way he always did when conflict threatened his illusion of family harmony, while Denise tried her usual strategy of pleading for unity, asking us to not do Christmas like this. But when I asked her what like this actually meant, she could not answer beyond muttering that I had embarrassed Evan and Lauren. I told her the truth in one sentence. I had not embarrassed anyone. The math had. The meeting became more charged when Pastor Mike appeared, evidently invited by my parents as a mediator, and for a moment I thought he would retreat into platitudes about forgiveness. But instead, he surprised me by turning directly to Evan and asking whether he had in fact used my name or email to obtain better terms on the refinance and the lease. Evan, cornered, muttered that everyone does that, which was both an admission and a defense rolled into one, and Pastor Mike's reply was so soft yet so damning, "Not this time." For the first time in years, someone other than me had held Evan to account in front of our parents, and the effect was like air rushing into a sealed room. Later that night, Lauren sent me a text that masqueraded as an apology but was really just public relations. She wrote that she thought using my email for the lender notice was harmless since I had once been the policy contact, and that she should have asked. I saved the screenshot without replying, because when someone phrases a confession as though it were a minor oversight instead of the deliberate misuse of your identity, there is nothing to discuss, only documentation to preserve. Mr. Kim, too, played his quiet part again by knocking on my door the next morning with a bag of mandarins and a signed confirmation that my name had been fully removed from the tenant file, telling me that he would be willing to speak to anyone about the correction if needed, a gesture of integrity that stood in stark contrast to my own brother's evasions. By the end of that week, the group chat, the same one that had once been full of holiday plans and recipe swaps, had transformed into a public record of unraveling. Evan still tried to frame me as vindictive, but then my aunt, who almost never spoke up in family matters, typed a single devastating sentence: "Evan, you brag about winning while your sister is paying your bills, and that's not winning." The silence that followed in the thread was deafening, because when a quiet relative puts the obvious truth in writing, even Denise could not rush in with a casserole of excuses to cover it. She did, however, privately beg me to delete the conversation before it spread further, but I refused, telling her that I would not erase numbers, dates, and receipts just to protect Evan's image. The final turn came when Pastor Mike asked me to meet him privately, saying he had learned something in his conversation with Evan that I deserved to know, and while I agreed, the way he framed it left me unsettled, because I could not tell whether this was about the refinance, the forged guarantor, or something older, something that had been buried for years under the family's desperate insistence on unity at any cost. Whatever it was, the fact that even he, the man who had officiated every milestone in our family, thought I needed to hear it made me realize that the story of Evan's manipulation was not nearly as confined to financial paperwork as I had once thought. When Pastor Mike asked to meet me at a small diner off the highway and finally shared the piece of information he had been holding, I realized that this conflict was never only about bills, policies, or technical liability, but about the way Evan had been constructing an image of himself on top of my invisible labor for years, because what Pastor Mike revealed was that back when our father had gone through his health scare and Medicare left gaps in coverage, I had quietly been paying for the supplemental medication that kept his treatment consistent, and during that exact same period Evan had pushed me to extend the phone plan, merge our insurance, and attach his family to my accounts under the guise of needing a win, admitting later in private that it allowed him to walk into rooms and project himself as the provider while I carried the cost. Hearing that from a neutral third party made me feel both nauseated and strangely calm, because it confirmed what I had suspected all along. Evan's entire persona as the winner of the family had been propped up by the scaffolding of my choices, and rather than being grateful, he had turned that scaffolding into a weapon to keep me permanently cast as the supposed loser. That knowledge did not break me, it clarified me, and with clarity came resolve. Fields prepared a formal settlement proposal that was not wrapped in emotion or family theatrics, but in the cold precision of deadlines and consequences. The document laid out 3 requirements. First, Evan and Lauren would sign letters admitting that they had used my contact information without permission and acknowledging that any future use would trigger legal action. Second, they would reimburse me for 2 months of documented expenses I had carried on their behalf, including utilities and the daycare discount that had been billed against my payroll. And third, they would transfer every single account, subscription, and service into their own names within 7 days, with confirmation provided in writing. If they failed to comply, Fields would file a small claims case supported by the lender's email that tied the refinance authorization to their IP address. It was not a negotiation, it was an ultimatum, because by that point I had no interest in compromise, only in closure. Before the letter was even delivered, Denise called again with the same tearful refrain about family unity, asking whether I was really prepared to miss Christmas entirely, and when I told her yes, she began crying in that quiet way that always used to break me, but this time I stood firm. I told her plainly that I was not choosing money over family. I was choosing adulthood over performance, and if she wanted to see me with her grandchildren, she was welcome to bring them to my home in January, where I would happily host them for pizza and a movie with their parents present, but I would no longer walk into a house where I had been labeled a loser while simultaneously footing the bills behind the curtain. She tried to argue that appearances mattered, that people would talk if I stayed away, and I told her appearances were exactly what had allowed this entire mess to fester, because Evan's image as a provider had been subsidized by my silence, and I was done subsidizing illusions. Around the same time, Ashley, my old colleague, sent me confirmation that the insurer had processed my data request and purged my email from Evan's claim records, attaching a public resource on consumer rights that I bookmarked. Not just for myself, but because I knew one day someone else in my position might need to understand how to cut the cords cleanly. She had never acted like a savior, but her steady guidance reminded me that unexpected benefactors do not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive in the form of professionals who quietly know the system and point you toward the exits. Evan made one last attempt to salvage his pride by calling me late at night with a long speech about legacy and family names, and how what I was doing would stain both, but I told him legacies are nothing more than ledgers people dress up as poetry, and what he called pride was nothing more than debt dressed up as bravado. He accused me of being cold, and I told him I was simply being accurate because self-respect has an interest rate, and mine had accrued for years. That was the last phone call. Within 48 hours of Field's letter, they signed the documents, transferred the accounts, and paid the reimbursement. Mr. Kim emailed me to confirm that the tenant file was now free of my name. The lender sent written confirmation that my information had been purged from the refinance, and the daycare officially removed my payroll discount from their system. For the first time in over a decade, I could look at my financial records and see only myself, no hidden liabilities trailing in the shadows. On Christmas Day, instead of sitting at a table where my presence was tolerated but not respected, I dropped off a bag of gifts for my nieces and nephews on my parents' porch, left a card addressed to them alone, and drove home without ringing the bell. I texted Denise to let her know the gifts were there with no strings attached, and she replied with a simple thank you followed by a hesitant, "Next year." I looked at those 2 words for a long moment before setting the phone down, because the real victory was not whether they invited me next year, but the realization that my peace no longer depended on their invitation. That evening, Evan sent me one final text, "Winners show up." I stared at it for a moment before replying with a line that had been waiting for years. "Winners pay their own bills." I set the phone face down and washed the last dish in my sink, feeling not triumphant but free, because this was never a revenge story. It was a paperwork story, a boundary story, and a story about refusing to buy a ticket into a room where you are not welcome. And yet, just when I thought the matter was closed, Denise forwarded me an email a week later showing that Evan's company had canceled its annual Winners Weekend sales retreat due to budget cuts, which meant that the man who had carved me out of Christmas with the line "for winners only" was now without the very platform he had used to elevate himself. She asked if I might consider meeting him for coffee to talk numbers, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was fitting. Maybe next year, maybe never. The point was that for the first time in my adult life, the choice belonged entirely to me, and I intended to keep it that way.